Well, hello, and thanks for joining me to hear my ideas about the evolved psychology of psychedelic set and setting. Most of what I have to say today is based upon this article here on the evolved psychology of psychedelic set and setting, which started out as an effort to try to integrate my thinking about the evolution of humanity via psychedelics and the evolution of shamanism as a framework for thinking about what are the best practices with respect to using psychedelics therapeutically. And so these ideas are, in a sense, a set of inferences based upon what we can infer about what happened in the past in terms of the intersection of shamanism and psychedelics in the evolution of human ritual capacities. Now, when we think about set and setting, we don't normally think of these as evolved capacities. Normally, set is considered to be a set of factors relative to the person, a set of personal features, such as their idiosyncratic personality, their mood, their expectation, that influences their experiences under the conditions of psychedelics. And the social influences are normally captured in the notion of setting. That is to say, how it is that the surrounding social context, the particular place in which you're doing the psychedelics, all of these influence the outcome of the experience. So normally, set and setting are considered to be arbitrary, individual, and cultural features of the psychedelic-induced experience. But I'm going to propose something quite different, that in fact, there is something natural about certain ways of approaching the use of psychedelics. For instance, most of you probably wouldn't think that going to a rugby game is a good place to do a big dose of LSD. On the other hand, going out in nature might seem like a great place to have a psychedelic experience. Or by another analogy, many of you might think, going to a concert would be a good place to do some shrooms as long as you had a good person to look out for you. But going to the Vietnam War Memorial and thinking about your dead relatives probably is not the best way to deal with a psilocybin experience unless you're trying to get over some traumatic emotions related to that. So why is it that concerts in nature seem like a good way to do psychedelics? Well, I think it's because of our evolved set and setting, which is to say that there are certain aspects of the evolution of the human capacity to use psychedelics that are related to particular kinds of context and influences, that there's certain innately disposed dispositions that have shaped our mood, our personality, expectations, even the kind of social relations and experiences that are optimal for psychedelic set and setting. In essence, a set of practices that accommodate our evolved psychology. And so in one sense, what I'm proposing is that the physiological nature of these psychedelics and the ways in which they are optimally incorporated into human behavior have an intersection. Now, you might say, well, this means that there must have been an evolution of humans under the influence of psychedelics. And I would say, bingo, you're right on. Did psychedelics shape our evolved psychology? In this article here that I wrote with Jose Rodriguez on psychedelic sociality and human evolution, we make an extensive set of arguments about how it is that our own human capacities evolved under the influence of psychedelics. And as a consequence, there's also a set of practices that evolved along with them. And I'm going to contend that those practices were shamanism and that we need to look to shamanism to understand what are best practices today for psychedelic use. So the overview of the paper or presentation here begins with a consideration of the relevance of shamanism to our evolved set and setting in general, and psychedelic set and setting in particular, pointing out that it's a communal ritual context in which psychedelics were likely incorporated into human culture, and that ritual context, shamanism, exerts a variety of extrapharmacological effects that can optimize the psychedelic experience because central aspects of shamanic ritual, ranging from fasting and austerities to drumming and dancing, provoke reactions in the serotonergic, dopaminergic, and endorphin systems of our body that enhance a variety of aspects of the psychedelic experience. I'm going to look at mimesis, a capacity for expressing meaning through the body and in particular, its instantiation through dance and music as a tool for stimulating the endogenous opioids and for enhancing ritually induced altered states of consciousness. And together, the endogenous opioids, the mimetic activities, and the altered states all elicit endogenous healing responses, some of which are reflected in innate experiences, such as a soul flight experience or out-of-body experience or a death and rebirth experience that has a variety of different kinds of therapeutic effects. So the shamanic set involves integrating these innate modular thought structures, the mimetic capacity, the spirit experiences, the out-of-body experiences, as a set of expectations, and then the setting would be this communal ritual context. I'm going to address one issue that's not in the Evolved Psychology paper, the idea of pivotal mental states that comes from a recent paper by Brar and Carhart-Harris, in which they propose that the similarity between psychosis and psychedelic states and the ability of psychedelics to provoke both mental disturbances as well as highly healthy states of recovery has to do with a pivotal mental state in which the contextual influences determine whether or not a very fluid and volatile situation goes towards health or goes towards pathology. And I'm going to say that shamanic approaches evolved out of an understanding of how these pivotal mental states could be, in fact, optimized by using a set of techniques, these shamanic practices, as a way of shaping this pivotal mental state towards a growth process and a better outcome. So a shamanic-informed psychedelic therapy is going to optimize set and setting using ritual frameworks that reflect this long-term adaptation of humans to the potentials of psychedelics. And in the end here, I'm going to look at a recent article on psychedelic somatic interactional therapy as somebody's idea about how we start to do this. So this starts deep in our evolutionary history. The biogenetic origins of our own hominid ritual traditions can be seen in the ritualization behaviors of apes, chimpanzees in particular. They show what our platform for hominin evolution, human evolution was, because ritual is the most important behavior in animals. It's how societies are put together, how they're regulated. And the chimpanzees have a very interesting set of behaviors. Nighttime group unification displays, normally initiated by the alpha male, who picks a tree and starts making long distance calls and drumming on the tree to let the group know where he is and where everybody should gather together for the night. And as each of the members of the group return to the fold in the tree, he makes an aggressive charge. They make a submissive posture. They get up in the tree, and the group gets together making emotional vocalizations and begin to engage in collective drumming on the trees and a variety of different calling patterns. Now, the ethologists tell us that these have very important functions. They use the sound to reunite the dispersed troop. It provides a mechanism for group integration, and in particular, reduction of aggression and release of tension. And these conspicuous displays, as they're often described in the literature, have a dynamic of enabling the group to show how powerful it is, intimidating predators. And so this collective ritual dynamic was an important part of our own evolutionary context for millions of years. And eventually this emerged into collective ritual healing practices that's also a central part of our evolved social psychology, not only because of the social integration effects they have, but also because of the ways in which they regulate emotions. So we can see in the context of shamanism a lot of homologies with these ancient hominid practices. High energy nighttime displays that incorporate all the local community, conspicuous bipedal displays or dancing in the case of humans, dramatic emotional vocalizations, various ways that the individual is integrated into the group, providing a lot of ways to protect the group both from internal aggression and external aggressors. So what I see in this context of the evolution of hominin rituals is how we get to what is shamanism. And these nighttime community reunion activities eventually developed into varieties of interactions with unseen forces, protection from spiritual powers, and the elicitation of endogenous healing responses, innate healing responses of our own genetic capacities. An important part of this development was carried out through the evolution of the mimetic suite that gives a capacity for dancing and singing and drumming, which in and of themselves both elicit endogenous healing responses and produce alterations of consciousness. So the evolutionary expansions of shamanism involved the expansion of this capacity for prolonged conspicuous displays. Chimp drumming is on the average about 12 seconds long. Shamanic drumming typically goes on for hours and hours and hours. The bipedal display of the chimps is normally a 5 or 10 second charge. Shamans dance for hours and hours. And the vocalizations themselves of the chimps, short periods of time. Shamans sing for hours and engage in a variety of different kinds of musical manifestations, song and chanting, etc. We also see in the expansion of shamanism a variety of beliefs regarding spirits as personal powers, particularly animals as personal powers and protectors, and the evolution of a prominent capacity for altered states of consciousness and a variety of very specific kinds of cognitive and experiential properties expressed in the notion of the soul flight out-of-body experience. We also see rituals of healing, diagnosis of information, particularly related to causes of illness, as well as mythic systems of explanation. What are the natures of these powers? How is it that they manage to heal us? So the roles of ritual and psychedelics have to be seen as an important set of influences that help explain the chimp-human ritual gap. So how was it that we developed these ritual capacities for healing? I think it was through what we've called psychedelic instrumentalization, the deliberate use of psychedelics to achieve goals, and that this instrumentalization, the deliberate use of psychedelics in the context of ritual, produced a coevolution of shamanism with the incorporation of psychedelics into culture in very specific kinds of ways. But I think we can make the argument that psilocybin played a very central role in the evolution of shamanism from this hominid basis. And you might say, have you proved that we ate psilocybin in the past? We haven't proved that we ate bananas in the past either, but nobody seems to really doubt that. In our paper, Psychedelic Sociality and Human Evolution, we look at the convergent evidence that shows that the use of psilocybin was inevitable. And then another set of publications I have in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, we show how widespread psilocybin practices were in ancient religions and even in the origins of modern religions. So I think that the evidence for the effects of psilocybin in our evolution can be seen in terms of their direct relationship to the kinds of experiences that are core to shamanism. That is to say, an entheogenic experience of entering a spiritual world. We know from the studies done at Johns Hopkins that these entheogenic experiences are intrinsic properties of psilocybin. They also stimulate wakefulness, and in many cultures thought to stimulate dancing, keep you up overnight, produce visionary experiences, produce the separation of the soul from the body, out of body experience, as well as in many cases, the death and rebirth experience that in the case of shamanism is thought to produce a significant feature of self-transformation. While it's not as common in psilocybin experiences, connections with animals is often reported, and even the experience of transformation into an animal is reported in many psychedelic experiences. Also, the idea of healing through spiritual powers and spiritual energies particularly energies evoked by song and music, which is often a core aspect of shamanic practice, and the acquisition of information in these visionary experiences. So all these features of shamanism are also typically found with psilocybin experiences in ritual settings, as well as a cosmological nature, a sense of a direct relationship to nature, a communion with an animated nature, including animal and spirit others. So I have elaborated on these ideas in this article on shamanism and psychedelics, a biogenetic structuralist paradigm of ecopsychology, in which I contend that, in fact, our very intrinsic ecopsychology principles have a set of influences that came from this intersection of shamanism and psychedelics. And that's why going to a concert seems to be a good thing to do on psilocybin, whereas going to a rugby match or a wrestling match probably doesn't seem like the best use of your shrooms. So the cross-cultural features of shamanism, just to briefly contextualize it here, overnight rituals, extensive drumming and dancing, chanting and singing. The purpose is to encounter spirits, to have visions, and the training practices involve training alone in the wilderness, a vision quest for spirit allies, often precipitated by prolonged fasting and sexual abstinence. Also, in many cases, other forms of austerity, self-torture, and the use of many kinds of medicinal plants, often characterized in a sparse ethnographic literature as what we might call emetics. During the shamanic development, there's an initiatory experience of being attacked and killed by animals, and then a rebirth experience involving being reconstructed by the animals. And in that process, often the experience of a personal transformation into an animal who becomes a kind of ally or other form of power that the shaman can call upon for doing diverse activities. Also, the alter state, the ASC, as a soul flight or astral projection, also seen in the out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and clinical death experiences of the modern world, and a set of healing practices based upon notions of soul loss, extraction of illness-causing objects, as well as countering the effects of sorcery. So these ought to be seen as kind of a context for the psychedelic set. What is it that we ought to be thinking about as a set of possibilities for what's going to happen in the context of the psychedelic experience? So why is shamanism cross-cultural? Why is it part of our human natures, I would say? Because it's based upon these hominid collective ritualization practices. They were extended for their psychosocial integration and therapeutic effects. And this extension had to do with a set of adaptations that occurred across the course of human evolution, including a set of capacities for extended altered states of consciousness that became part of our innate psychology, altered states that were induced not only by the ritual activities, but also by this mimetic suite, even by the acquisition of capacities such as long distance running, be able to dance for 4 or 5 or 6 hours. The ability of these altered neurophysiological states, enhanced neurotransmitter conditions, to elicit a variety of endogenous healing responses and to stimulate our innate intelligences. Experiences of spirits reflect the ability to perceive the social world in certain kinds of ways. And we have also, what I will add into this talk, this idea of exploiting pivotal mental states, these crisis periods where we can either degenerate into a psychotic episode or develop a higher level self-integration that enables us to resolve conflicts and integrate our capacities at a higher level of functionality. So the altered state of consciousness has to be understood both as set and setting. That is to say, a set of prior concepts about what's going to happen, as well as a set of practices in the moment to help induce an alteration of consciousness. And so what I would point out is the implications of this is in using psychedelics, it's not just a matter of taking the psychedelics, it's getting your body into a condition in which the effects of the psychedelics will be optimized. How do shamans prepare for their rituals? Fasting, sometimes complete fasting for several days, social isolation, sometimes for several days before ceremony, periods of sexual abstinence before and after ritual, engaging both in prolonged periods of sleeplessness as well as dream incubation, and the use of various psychoactive substances. The nighttime or overnight ceremonies also provided a set for thinking about how it is to incorporate our unconscious potentials, incorporating dream processes into our psychedelic experiences through overnight ceremonies, where when we sit down and relax during the period between 2 to 5 in the morning, it's just natural that we slip into dreams. And then the use of song and dance, which stimulate a variety of neurotransmitter systems, beginning with the endogenous opioid system, but also stimulating the dopaminergic, serotonergic, and endocannabinoid systems. To understand the importance of inducing altered states through these kinds of ritual activities and the setting of the ritual, the singing, the dancing, the drumming, I think we need a general model of altered states that provides a common framework for understanding the similarities in both drug and naturally or ritually induced altered state of consciousness. So I've published this in a number of my different articles and in the shamanism book, in which I propose that a general model of altered states of consciousness involves deregulating the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network and disrupting the normal regulatory dynamics of the cortical, striatal, thalamical, cortical loops. And what this does is liberate the basal areas of the brain, the ascending serotonergic circuits from the thalamus and brain stems up to the emotional or limbic brain and continuing into the frontal cortex. Basically, ultimately, a deregulation of serotonergic inhibition that allows for a bottom-up brain dynamic that is paralleled perfectly in what psychedelics do. If you're familiar with Vollenweider's research, you'll know for 20 years or more, he's been talking about how psychedelics liberate these lower thalamic brainstem networks and propel their projection into the frontal networks. To my thinking, what this is doing is liberating the unconscious mind, and in particular, liberating the innate intelligences and innate cognitive operators. So in this article on the mechanisms of psychedelic visionary experiences, I integrate this evolutionary psychology thinking into the integration of information about what we know about psychedelics, as well as meditation-induced and spontaneously occurring altered states, and say, look, the evidence is here that they all have this similar profile. Disrupt the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, enable the emergence and elevation of these ancient cognitive processes that are manifested in this slow wave theta discharges that link the basal brain with the frontal cortex. And what enhances this kind of response is what I see as the core of shamanic evolution, the mimetic capacity. Mimesis is a multimodal expressive capacity, allows us to use the body to communicate, show and tell, mime, gestures, communicating through imitation, or using music and song and dance and other forms of enactment to enable the body to function as a metaphor. So in essence, we have a generative expressive system that has to do with the body. You know, that means one thing, that means something different. And this means something else. And this means something else. Our body communicates a lot of things. And so this is where the shamanic capacity engaged in our innate modular structures to create a generative expressive system that enables symbolic meaning, but a kind of natural symbolic meaning through these enactive metaphors. And the capacity of these enactive metaphors to intuitively communicate comes from the ability of the mirror neurons to provide an understanding of others. Mirror neurons are a set of neurons that function both as motor neurons and as sensory neurons. The same neural systems are elicited by engaging in an intentional behavior and then watching another member of our species engage in the same intentional behavior. So the same neurons fire for engaging in the behavior and understanding another's behavior. And so we have an intuitive way of acquiring an understanding of others and acquiring a set of meanings that are intuitive, yet they are, in a sense, exactly mirroring what others are thinking. So shamanism exemplifies this mimetic capacity in a lot of different activities: group dancing, drumming, clapping, song, music, the enactment of animal powers, enactment of struggles against the spirits. We have to understand that this whole set of suite of behaviors linked to mimesis is a kind of neural technology for group enhancement, using a bodily kinesthetic intelligence expressed in music and dancing to evoke endogenous opioids, which not only make us feel more bonded with others, but also enhances our capacity to enter into altered states of consciousness. The music and the dancing also stimulate dopamine, norepinephrine, and communal singing elicits oxytocin, which is a widely distributed social bonding hormone found in mammalian species. So the classic image of the shaman, the event shaman in this case, imitating animals, engaging in a dramatic dance, beating on the drum, singing, calling out. This is a set of innate capacities that elicits a variety of different responses in humans, in part because they engage a variety of intuitive communicative systems. It also is based upon this ability to perceive the mindset of others, to infer their thoughts, and ultimately to identify with others based upon a mimetic double, an alter ego that's part of our emotional understanding of others that we incorporate through the mirror neuron system. So in essence, this capacity of mimesis provides a social consciousness, an awareness of the other, but also the ability to incorporate the other's behavior as a model for understanding ourselves. In essence, mimesis provides the platform for empathy, where reciprocal physiological and social experiences mediated by the mirror neurons enable us to feel what others feel, to sense what they sense, to infer their thoughts. This kind of behavior, also incorporated in the context of ritual, elicits a variety of endogenous healing responses. So, for instance, we have the dramatic displays, which are, in a sense, a kind of protective mechanism. Having a big, powerful alpha male up there running around, screaming and yelling, dancing, intimidates other animals and makes you feel protective. So it elicits the parasympathetic response that counters stress. It enhances a kind of hypnotic susceptibility, placebo responses. These kinds of dynamic social events also elicit psychoneuroimmunological responses, where the social bonding activities and the endogenous opioid release also contribute to enhanced immunological activity. So neurological responses elicited by mimetic activities such as dance and music have direct consequences for our endogenous healing responses. Music is one of these widely recognized modular intelligences, an aspect of mimesis that also has the capacity to evoke a variety of biologically determined emotional states. There's a 30, 40-year tradition of music as a healing modality. There's whole journals dedicated to music and healing. Why? Because music engages a variety of biological functions that induce healing, including relaxation, stress reduction, enhancing emotional harmony, transforming basic emotions. Indeed, most music in the world is focused on transforming heart emotions. It's about love and well-being and connections with others. It also can provoke healing through the release of repressed emotions, which is to say, music has this capacity to evoke biologically determined emotional states, including sadness and grief, where they can be elevated releasing the repressed emotions and providing a context in which these traumatic experiences of the past can be transformed through other forms of music that, in essence, is a technology for coordinating emotional states with sound, with the needs of the person, and contributing to enhancing their interpersonal relations, particularly through contributing to enhanced emotional bonding. Listening to music together, dancing together, drumming together, all of this elicits the endogenous opioid system, as does dancing. So dancing has to be understood as an expansion of these conspicuous displays that animals make because they enhance their reputation within the group by showing their excessive fitness, contributing to their social dominance. These kinds of displays also serve as an interspecies signaling mechanism, showing that there's a powerful dominant animal present that protects the group. They also stimulate altered states of consciousness. A typical pattern that we see in shamanism is the sympathetic stimulation of dance, followed by a relaxation or parasympathetic phase that allows for a variety of reduction of stress to occur. Dance also engages what is called the habitus, or expressed bodily realities that are largely unconscious, but are also central to our personal and often interpersonal identity. So the participatory experiences of dance are, in essence, a kind of social technology that enables us to modify personal dispositions and our sense of social connectedness with others, our social sensibilities. It's not by chance that dance is seen, for instance, as a kind of mating ritual, because it is in most animal species, and humans still use that today as a way of connecting with people at the level of the body. There's also an emerging dance therapy movement. When you see DMT, it's not always what you think it is. Sometimes it's dance movement therapy, core aspect of shamanism. Dance is found in virtually all cultures around the world as a ritual mechanism as well as a therapeutic mechanism. And it's a therapeutic mechanism because it has the ability to elicit intrinsic emotional reactions, catharsis, liberates emotions, as well as allows for an unconscious dynamic to be expressed in the nonverbal behavior. So the dance, in a sense, brings us down into our body, allows us to release ego control to the body intelligences, and to emerge into this ancient bodily expressive modality that permits the expression of certain kinds of emotional states, as well as the psychological integration of those unconscious states, and ultimately a kind of self-actualization process that's achieved through the integration of the mind and the body in the context of altered states of consciousness that permits a new level of self-integration to emerge. So when we look at the entheogenic experiences in general, I will argue that these are, in essence, an aspect of our own innate intelligences. What we perceive in altered states or in normal reality as spirits and spirit reality is, in essence, the integration of social intelligences. That is to say, we have an innate intelligence for perceiving others, for understanding what they want, mind reading, not in a parapsychological sense, but in an inferential sense, and the incorporation of others, like in possession, but is normal socialization. We incorporate the patterns of our parents and the people around us, the way they think, they talk, they move, because we have this innate intelligence to want to be like powerful others. And so I think this can be an explanatory framework for understanding the importance of spirits in entheogenic experiences, because these kinds of processes are important in normal socialization and social role incorporation. And these kinds of innate intelligences are exemplified in the DMT experiences that seem to perplex so many people. Why do we see elves and dwarves and goblins and human-like angels and spirits, etc.? Well, because these innate intelligences are being stimulated the unconscious structures of our brain are being released by the disabling of the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network. Furthermore, these kinds of release patterns exemplified in altered states of consciousness tend to have a synesthetic quality. They're integrated, combined together. And these are symbols. So spirits can be seen as primordial symbols in which we try to use our social intelligence to understand the unseen causal mechanisms. So these innate cognitive operators, I think, ought to be viewed as intrinsic features of set and setting, in the sense that what we want to do is to expect to encounter human-like entities and to seek these out in our experiences. So in this article here on the ontology of psychedelic entity experiences in evolutionary psychology and neural phenomenology, what I try to do is bring together this evolutionary psychology with neural phenomenological perspectives that allow us to understand the prevalent features of psychedelic experiences as reflecting something intrinsic to our innate intelligences. So I'll just briefly look at this slide here, in essence, pointing out that there's a variety of aspects of psychedelic shamanic set and setting that reflect the innate intelligences. Here on the left side, the innate intelligences from Gardner: interpersonal intelligence, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, language, mathematical intelligence, musical, spatial, naturalistic, or animal intelligence. And Gardner in his update even included spiritual and existential intelligences. And when we look at these innate intelligences, they map directly onto what we see in shamanic experiences: the spirits and spirit communication, ritual enactment, divination, even the entoptic forms, the mathematical constants, the geometrical universes that are so prevalent in DMT. These are innate intelligences as well. I have argued in a number of places that our spatial intelligence can be seen as one of the bases for the out-of-body experiences. The importance of animals reflects this naturalistic intelligences, and even the ideas of spiritual explanations and beliefs, mythologies, universal features found in all cultures reflect the activations of these innate intelligences. So an animistic cosmology or an animistic neural theology is basically a normal form of experiencing the world. These biologically structured modes of knowing, e.g. innate operators, innate intelligences, lead us normally and naturally to perceive spirits, something out there that has social qualities, personal qualities, emotions, expectations, and an important message for us. We just don't have the full sense of a person, but all the qualities inherent to a social being. I would propose that these are behavioral and emotional communication functions, what has been called proto-mentation and emotio-mentation, that express our innate animal, emotional, social, and mental capacities and natures. And it's also a set of processes that enable us to normally and naturally incorporate animal identities as well as the information that comes from these states. So the psychedelic visions have to be viewed as an innate visualization process. The disinhibition of the dopaminergic system produces visual syndromes manifested in pathologies, manifested in diseases, manifested in dreams, and manifested in shamanic experiences. Psychedelics naturally induce this information-rich visual system, but people can also engage these systems without using psychedelics, for instance, using Groff's holotropic breath work. But in the case of the psychedelics, we see this increased connectivity in the visual regions of the brain, enhanced primary processing, the increased availability of unconscious mental material, and the forcible presentation of these images, of these experiences to the person. Now, we have a long history of considering these to be hallucinations and perhaps not very important, but I think we've missed the boat here. These are not hallucinations. These are symbols. This is important information. This is stuff that's coming out of the unconscious, synthetically, syncretically integrated to provide information in what has been called presentational symbolism People have also discussed this as a fantasy mode of consciousness, but it is a ancient human modality of visual cognition, a natural system that emerges from unconscious brain processes, not just in psychedelic visions, but in dreaming and in daydreaming and imagination. It's a system that represents our internal mental life as well as the relationships with the external world. So the shamanic engagement with dreams is a way to enhance this kind of capacity to communicate. Dreams are a mammalian adaptation for learning. It's a way of consolidating information during sleep. And that is one of the major functions of dreams. It's an enhanced capacity to integrate learning and material from ordinary life into our unconscious information integration, and then ultimately to integrate the unconscious material into waking consciousness. So what we're getting out of the engagement with dreams is access to novel information and access to a capacity for virtual scenario construction, which is to say, we can sort of engage in this, visual imagination using our innate intelligences, doing so in a state that we get an enhanced integration of unconscious information that can be used to resolve conflict, to release trauma, or to even engage in planning through an active imagination, to use this as a capacity for change. So seeking dream information for personal integration would be a natural set of shamanic practice. Shamans often engaged in pre-ritual retreats to sort of program their ritual through getting dream information beforehand, and then during the ritual, engaging in periods of overnight activity so that they naturally enter into the dream periods, and then reintegrating that information. So dreams should be seen as key tools that allow us to integrate information from the unconscious. Now, one of the ways in which shamanism focused on this integration of unconscious information was through the soul journey. This idea that they would separate from the body and move into another realm in which they would encounter entities, find lost souls, connect with their allies, confront other sorcerers. And this kind of consciousness is part of our innate capacities. We see the same basic kinds of features that we see in soul journeys in things such as astral projection, if you use that concept today. Also, the kinds of near-death experiences have homologous features where some experiential part of the self that's very much tied to a visual field, but very much tied also to our social self, separates from the physical body. And so these innate psychophysiological structures are being selectively engaged and disengaged. The visual capacity, self-reference, is engaged, but independent of the physical or mimetic body. So some psychologists have proposed that this reflects an innate capacity to take perspectives, but others' perspectives towards the self, and then to take this whole context of the self and its emotional qualities into this experiential state in which a variety of different kinds of transformations can occur. One of the transformations that occur in the context of shamanic practice is what's called the death and rebirth experience. A central part of the initiatory crisis of the shaman was a personal death. The idea that the shaman went into the wilderness, engaged in a vision quest, was in a sense attacked by animals who tore the shaman apart, dismembered the shaman, ate the shaman, and then took the bones and put the shaman back together again, incorporating their animal properties into the reconstructed, reborn shaman through the qualities of the animals to integrate a new set of powers and possibilities. So this death and rebirth experience, this dismemberment, can be understood as an autosymbolic image reflecting the breakdown of the self, the breakdown of the identity, a kind of stress response that produces a fragmentation of the ego, but then because of this breakdown allows for a self-transformation to occur. So this death and rebirth experience as a kind of auto-symbolic imagery of self-transformation that reflects the death of the current identity of this afflicted, troubled individual who now engages in a reformulation, a self-transformation that allows them to emerge with a new identity, a wounded healer, a transformed person who now has the capacity to help others. And they achieve this through a psychological reorganization that's provoked by the innate tendencies towards holism. So this idea of an archetypal drive towards transcendence and new identity is part of what I see as a core aspect of shamanism, something that frequently occurs to people in psychedelic experiences and which ought to be further exploited, not only as the psychological set going in, but perhaps various aspects of music, of enactment, of drama that can help provoke these kinds of experiences in the person. So this is where I want to tie in to what Brower and Carhart Harris have discussed as pivotal mental states. They discuss these as a kind of period of elevated cortical plasticity that occurs in response to high levels of stress that then leads to a state of enhanced associative learning and psychological transformation mediated by the effects on the 5-HT2A serotonergic system. So this pivotal mental state is invoked by chronic stress and then precipitated by acutely stressful events that also can lead to the enhanced response of the 5-HT2A signaling system, which has the capacity to provide for enhanced serotonin signaling, hyperplastic mental state, and enhanced associative learning capacity, and the increased processes of personal and psychological transformation. Now, it turns out that many of the things that shamanic ritual involves provoke this kind of reaction in the serotonergic system as well. Things such as fasting, prolonged sleeplessness, high periods of stress, physical and emotional pain, all of these trigger these serotonergic responses, as well as the kinds of crisis that then leads to this pivotal state in which either the person can break down into a psychotic condition or engage in a psychological transformation. So what they propose as a fundamental function of the pivotal mental states, and which I would also argue is an evolved function that allowed for humans to use the ritual practices of shamanism to produce psychological transformation when the demands upon the person exceeded the capacities of their self and self resources to mediate divergent kinds of demands. So what I see in these pivotal mental states is an opportunity for psychological transformation, for rapid learning, and for doing so through relaxing the priors and engaging in a multi-level pathway of serotonergically mediated self-transformation. So here I sort of, reiterate this. Stress activates the serotonin 2A receptor system, and that shamanic practices such as social isolation, fasting, sleep deprivation, acute pain also elicit this system. And what we have is basically a set of practices that became incorporated into shamanism naturally, inevitably, because these are the things that happen if you get lost and you're alone in the wilderness for a couple days. Prolonged isolation, fear, fasting, painful activities, extensive exercise such as running from animals, periods of sleeplessness, all of the things that can naturally happen to you if you get separated from your group, then also can become the same technologies used to produce these pivotal mental states that then enable this enhanced serotonergic response to produce transformation of consciousness. So in a sense, this kind of natural modification of consciousness that occurs when you get lost and isolated in the wilderness can be exploited as a set of tools for enhancing our ability to transform ourselves psychologically. Shamans also engaged in a transformation through the use of power animals. These are natural symbols for identity development. They're part of our innate intelligences. We intuitively understand the qualities of animals just by looking at them. Even small children who have never seen animals understand which ones you can cuddle with and which ones are going to eat you if they get a chance. So shamans engage this innate intelligence as a way to incorporate animal powers into their identities. The fear of being attacked by an animal, the breakdown of the self-structure naturally led to this period of introjection where the elevation of these innate intelligences would naturally present the animals and their animal qualities as a model for self-identity, for behavior, for new attitudes towards life. And the shamanic engagement with the animals provided a tool for personality transformation. In my book, Shamanism, I have pointed out how these kinds of concepts provide a hierarchy of control for trying to manage an internally differentiated social self. As society becomes more complex, we too become more complex with different selves for different contexts, for different people, for different relations. And how do we balance these different demands for parental, kinds of inclinations, for social affiliation inclinations, for the kinds of aggressive kinds of behaviors we need to protect ourselves against animals, etc. These animal powers become a tool for this kind of integration. So it's an integration of these animal identities into our behavior, utilizing this natural history intelligence that's based upon an innate ability to recognize the quality of species, and also provides a system of meaning, an analogical system for meaning. If I say to a woman, you're a pig, it has a set of intrinsic meanings that are very different than if I have to say, you're a fox, okay? It's not a cultural set of meanings, it's an intrinsic set of meanings. And these kinds of projective systems are used both in shamanism as well as in societies where practices of totemism, clans, utilize animal species to identify social groups. So what we're seeing in the context of shamanic practice is this capacity to co-opt the normal processes of socialization, to integrate these kinds of intrinsic principles in order to engage our unconscious abilities to incorporate animal intelligences. So the spirit world is a kind of natural psychology, a neurognostic system that incorporates the archetypal structures. These biopsychosocial structures of human nature are, in essence, our unconscious complexes as well as our innate social intelligences. And so these DMT entities that are so popular today are basically innate modular intelligences. And so you can look on ResearchGate to see where I've elaborated on some of these ideas in this article on the supernatural as innate cognitive operators. So I'm going to sort of move quickly through this idea of supernatural others and innate social intelligence ought to be part of the set and setting that we take into the psychedelic experience. We ought to see this as an opportunity for self-development through internalization of the roles of spirit others as models, and even using the concept of animal powers as intrinsic symbol systems to not only enhance our self-awareness, our personal identity, but also perhaps to incorporate them in a way that enhances our own capacities to behave in different ways. And if you just want to play with this, spend the day acting like a mouse. See how that affects your behavior. Don't get on your fours, but just think about acting in a mouse-like way. Or spend the day acting like a tiger. Your friends might not like it, but you'll see the effects that it has upon them. These animals can transform the way that we be. So what does this say about the shamanic best practices? Well, a preparatory set involving austerities, fasting, sexual abstinence, even social isolation. You got to be careful who you deal with the day before, the day of psychedelic experiences. I have had psychedelic trips turn into real downers because of the people that showed up to talk to me right before I decided to take something. The setting, this should be an overnight communal ritual. And so I find it kind of interesting how so often the sort of standard psychedelic research approach these days is, you take your psilocybin at 8 or 9 in the morning, you're pretty much done by 3 or 4 in the afternoon, but you stay in the hospital overnight. Well, wait, that's when you're supposed to be on the psychedelics. Communal ritual. This may be a very important model for rethinking the psychedelic healing approaches. It can help us address some of the serious problems that they present. Now you need to have a qualified person attending the person who's taking the psychedelics for up to 24 hours. And it needs to be a male and a female. And this becomes exorbitantly expensive. Communal use of these kinds of substances could perhaps dramatically reduce the demand for qualified sitters. Indeed, I've seen lots of different kinds of psychedelic rituals in which a single, person, the ritualist, effectively manages the need of a dozen or more people. So bringing the communal dimension in also will create a lot of other kinds of interpersonal dynamics that can enhance the healing experiences. We need to stimulate these ancient mimetic capacities, music, dance, and enactment, as part of the ritual setting. And we need to engage with this set of incorporating the capacities or our innate psychology as represented in spiritual others, particularly animal relations, and engaging with this capacity for presentational symbolism, not as a fun trip and something fun to do, but rather as an important informational context. The altered states of death and rebirth, soul flight, and the animal powers ought to be expanded through dream incubation before the ritual setting, as well as engaging with these openness to these kinds of experiences during the ritual setting as a way of enhancing access to unconscious processes. And as part of that, we ought to see the spirit world and developing relationships with the spirit world as a natural psychological development of addressing these pivotal mental states, of engaging these kinds of capacities. And I would suggest that this neurognostic perspective, this notion that we have a reptilian brain and a mammalian brain, these ancient brain structures, is an important way of seeing how it is that we can incorporate the unconscious through animal brains, through our animal bodies. So has this happened yet? Well, just as I was finishing up my article on the evolved psychology of set and setting and responding to the reviewers' comments, I saw this article in the Journal of Psychedelic Psychiatry, the introduction of a novel method of therapy, the psychedelic somatic interactional psychotherapy. So I'm going to try to briefly present some of these ideas. They point out that psychedelics engage primary consciousness involving body sensations, emotions, non-declarative memory, non-verbal processes, a primary consciousness. But what we see in most clinical approaches is a talk therapy that addresses secondary consciousness. We need a therapy that addresses the primary consciousness experiences provoked by psychedelics. So the psychedelic somatic interactional psychotherapy would use things that access the unconscious relational self, perception, cognition, emotions, communication, the implicit mechanisms lying below conscious awareness, the embodied awareness, the sense of body and self that's not conscious and rational, but part of our unconscious somatic or habitus. And this is where the emotions of anxiety, depression, dissociation, and relational trauma are present. So how do we engage this? Well, we have to engage these psychobiological intelligences that come from destabilizing the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, access these ancient mammalian structures, that allow us to evoke the person's emotional own internal world and engage their own natural biological processes. So questions about feeling and thinking are very different ones. Obviously, the emotional ones are more important for processing psychedelic experiences. So they propose that this psychedelic somatic therapy focuses on personal and relational aspects and doesn't allow the person, even in the context of the experience, to engage in spiritual bypassing, where they have a kind of mystical or transcendental experience where they say, okay, I understand all this happened to me, I can move on, but they return home and the same dynamics are still there. They didn't move on, they're still stuck with those kinds of traumatically embedded experiences. So we need to find ways to activate the autonomic nervous system's self-correcting mechanisms that allow us to process anxiety and distress, depression and stress, complex relational trauma through body-based pathways that are engaged by psychedelics and their pre-language cognitive processing channels. They place this approach in the context of the defense cascade of the mammalian autonomic nervous system. Most mammals move into hypervigilant states when they're stressed, and then move into high stress states that allow for flight or fight arousal. And once they do this, then they move on and go back to their relaxed state. But humans tend to engage in the third and fourth state, defensive responses in the face of overwhelming trauma, leading to depression and ultimately even to traumatic dissociation because of repeated exposure to stress. We don't reset. We need to find ways to reset this autonomic cascade. The authors propose a three-tiered approach: staying present during the psychedelic experience, developing a healthy ego structure to deal with the trauma. Don't move to a higher spiritual level that allows you to surpass the trauma, because it doesn't surpass it. You need to be fully present in the self, integrate primary and secondary consciousness, to engage in an embodied, relationally present moment that allows one to integrate these experiences and then to share them in a spiritual context and a community format after the psychedelic experiences have subsided. So this transition from the psychedelic experience to being present, to staying present during the psychedelic experience, and then sharing it relationally afterwards. I think that the idea of mimesis and habitus here is very important. Habitus, a concept out of sociology that addresses the way in which ingrained behavioral habits and emotional dispositions are part of our ways of being in the world, the customary ways of perceiving the world, perceiving others, reacting that we acquire from our shared social experiences. When we are socialized, it's just not language and the brains and ideas. There are cultural and personal dispositions that are embodied in our physical body, mostly in unconscious behaviors that shape our perceptions, our assumptions, our emotions, even our postures, our physical expressions, the gestures we use, but extends into moral evaluations, our habits, our relationships with others. Our personal and cultural identities are not constructs that are largely derived from our thinking selves, but rather acquired largely unconsciously in the processes of socialization, and can include dissociated, depressed, traumatized aspects of the self. We need to figure out how to reprogram the habitus to engage with this bodily level of consciousness and awareness and feelings. And dance, to me, seems to be one of the important modalities to engage. Dancing and music ought to be more centrally part of engaging this mimetic modality that can be a mechanism for expressing these unconscious states, as well as reprogramming them once they are elevated. So mimetic engagement provides for a link with the habitus through the engagement of the motor body, the sensory somatic system, the affective linkages, and when it's communal, with the social dynamics of the group, which provides various dimensions for psychosocial transformation. So by providing a system for coordinated expression through bodily actions, through dance, we develop this ability to non-verbally express important emotional dynamics and then change them through the dynamics of dance, reworking the bodily dynamics, changing these acquired dispositions, allowing music and the expressive dynamics of the body to provide a mechanism through which the psychedelic enhanced awareness can provide a deeply embedded mechanism for changing. And in this sense, a wide variety of bodily based therapies ought to be considered as significant adjuncts for psychedelic therapy. So we need to treat rituals as technologies of healing that can enhance the capacity of the psychedelic experience to produce transformation and change. Group, and I emphasize group, collective, chanting, drumming, and dancing are social bonding technologies. They elicit our endogenous opioid responses. They enhance our sense of personal well-being and connection with others. Rituals are not empty kinds of activities. Rituals are deeply embedded parts of our innate psychology that are important processes for transforming our social relations, our physiological responses, and even transforming emotional responses, and coordinating all these together. We need to think about the ways in which a variety of aspects of ritual prepare us for eliciting endogenous healing processes. What you do the day before and the day of your ritual with psychedelics is an important part of engaging the social dynamics of these endogenous opioid-mediated attachment mechanisms and their ability to elicit placebo responses, hypnotic susceptibility, and ultimately psychoneural immunological responses. So the idea of group sharing, I think, ought to be seen not just as a nice way for you to externalize what has happened to you in the experience, but also to transform the emotions. And while most of the group sharings that I participated in relative to psychedelic communal therapies have normally had the rule, you don't comment on other people's experiences. I think a mechanism that incorporates that can be in a very important way of the social transformation of personal emotions that can happen through this kind of sharing. Dreams need to be further exploited as a key aspect of the extrapharmacological influences, not just incorporated into shamanism, but also now incorporated into a way of finding the optimal way to use psychedelics for therapeutic transformation. Dream work beforehand and afterwards ought to be seen as an explicit way of further integrating information from the unconscious, particularly providing the access to visual forms that in their original evolutionary adaptive function were to enhance learning and memory integration. I think that this too can be used as a tool to expand the ways in which psychedelic experiences can be prolonged and further incorporated into the transformation of the unconscious into conscious awareness. So I've laid out the shamanic paradigm in my book here, Shamanism, a biopsychosocial paradigm of consciousness and healing. And I outline here the ways in which the altered states of consciousness, the use of ritual, and the engagement with the spirit world ought to be seen as neural Gnostic technologies, as tools that allow us to engage in the fundamental transformation of our self and well-being. And I encourage you to think about the shamanic paradigm as the way to develop best practices for psychedelic therapy. Thanks.